One way of thinking about this is, again, thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic and how many people were loners and introverts and elected to spend time on their own before the pandemic. But once the restrictions were in place and they were not allowed to be around other people, they had a much harder time emotionally with the isolation than when it was self-imposed, because there's a choice there.
Hey everybody, before we start the show, I want to make a couple disclaimers. This show does cover a wide variety of topics related to mental health and life in general, and some of those could be sensitive for you. I want to simultaneously encourage you to be brave in consuming difficult content, but also respect and recognize your limitations. So please use your best judgment. I will never be offended if you need to skip a question or an episode entirely, but feel free to feel it out, check out the episode, and just see what happens. If you need to skip, that's okay, but feel free to give it a shot first. I also need to say that while I am a psychologist, I'm not your psychologist and I'm not your therapist. This is not intended to be direct medical advice, and you should not use this as a substitute for professional help. So with those said, let's go ahead and get into the show.
All right. Hello, friends of all varieties. This is the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast, episode 357. I'm your host, Dr. Robert Duff, aka Duff the Psych. I make mental health content for real people just like you. And today I have an awesome question and answer episode for you. Two really good questions from listeners like yourselves. I wanted to ask you guys to please send in some more questions. I'm running a little bit low, which is something I haven't really had happen for a while. So if you have questions, big or small, please send them to me at duffthepsych@gmail.com or use the contact form on my website at duffthepsych.com. I'd really appreciate it. I have some questions in the bucket, but I also need more variety so I can keep the questions and episodes interesting. But thank you to everybody who has sent in questions, especially this last week when I needed some more. Really, really appreciate it. I'm using a couple new ones that I got today. I also wanted to mention that the other day, it wasn't, this past week or even the week before, but I forgot to tell you guys, when I do the end of the year episode or beginning of the year episode where I talk about my word for the year and my goals and such, I mentioned that it usually just comes to me randomly. And it did the other day. So I already now know what my word for the next year is going to be. I'm not going to tell you until the end of the year or the beginning of the year. But it did give me a prompt to think about my current word, which is identity. And if you guys joined along and made a word for the year, this is just a gentle nudge for you to remember what that word is and consider sort of where you're at in your journey with that word for the year. I have taken that as a prompt to do a little bit more self-reflection in terms of just, talking out loud to myself and processing and digging in a little bit more. And whatever that looks like for you, I'm giving you permission to go ahead and do that. It's good to kind of reconnect with these things throughout the year rather than just sort of, setting a thought or intention at the beginning of the year and letting it go to shit later on. So this is your nudge. And I'm excited for next year's one. It's going to be a challenge and it's going to be interesting. So that's all I'll say about that for now. But wherever you are, I hope you are enjoying yourselves. I hope that you are taking some time to take care of yourself along with taking care of other people and working on all the stuff that you have to work on. Let's go ahead and just get into the questions. The first one here is actually from somebody that I know. A friend of mine sent it on Instagram this time, which is awesome. I'm not going to say who they are, but shout out to you if you're listening. So, question goes, I'm unsure if this is something you covered, but medications, specifically antidepressants of all kinds. When to gauge whether or not you're done with that journey when your doctor tells you most stay on them lifelong, and you're not sure if lifelong is the journey for you. How to gauge if the meds are working at their full potential, or if you've improved your mental health enough to know you would be okay without them. This is a personal struggle of mine. I've been mulling over the idea of coming off of them for the past 4 to 5 months. Thank you. This is a super good question. I don't know that I've covered this before on the show. Maybe, maybe not, but I'm honestly surprised it doesn't come up more often because this is a question that many people wonder about. Essentially, how do you know if you can or should come off of psychiatric medications? And in this case, particularly, we're talking about antidepressants. So these are things like SSRIs, so selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Those would be things like your Lexapro or Prozac. SNRIs, so selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, Effexor, Cymbalta would be examples of those. Tricyclics, so your triptylines like amitriptyline, nortriptyline, and then a few other atypical ones like Wellbutrin. And this is an important distinction, saying that we're talking about antidepressants, because as I've covered in other recent episodes, conditions like bipolar or schizophrenia tend to be much more dependent on medication for their treatment. Depression, on the other hand, responds to various approaches. So, for example, research shows that consistent cardiovascular exercise has a similar effect size in terms of its antidepressant effect to SSRI medication. So, unlike other types of disorders, depression is one where you can throw a lot of different things at it. You can be a little bit more creative with your approach. Now, I would push back a little bit on your doctor's statement that most people stay on antidepressants lifelong. I don't think that's true. There aren't a ton of data out there, but some studies that I could find when I was looking into this to sort of check my gut feeling about it indicates that the percentage of people that stay on antidepressants lessens year upon year of continued use. So meaning, a good portion of people studied stay on antidepressants for up to a year. Up to 2 years, it drops down. Up to 3 years, it drops down. One study indicated that only about 14% continued after 5 years. So this is a very individualized question. I think there's a ton of variation in there. And honestly, I think statements like most people do aren't really helpful here. That's not necessarily the case, and who gives a shit? That doesn't apply to you necessarily. For some people, it may be most helpful to remain on antidepressants for many years, sometimes lifelong. And for others, it's more helpful for them to use them throughout a certain season of their life and then eventually discontinue them. People also tend to go off and on medication over the years. I've encountered many people that live a successful life without medication after having previously been on it, but they also know that medications are an option if they need additional help beyond what their efforts and other interventions can provide, somewhere down the line. So that's kind of my general thoughts about what your doctor said, and I want to now address sort of the question directly for you. First off, I want to congratulate you. The fact that you've been considering whether you may be okay without your meds in the first place, you said for the past 5 months or so, that's awesome. That means that you're in a place where you're already feeling not as crushed by the symptoms of your depression, that you have no question that you need them. The fact that there is a question there, I think, is a sign of significant progress. So, kudos to you. It's admittedly a confusing calculus, though. It's a hard thing to figure out. Because if medications are working the way that they should, ideally you feel less depression and less held back by your depression symptoms. But when you feel less symptoms, you also don't feel like you need the medications as much. So it's a little confusing. And in that way, I think that we can't just purely look at symptoms, so depression symptoms, as the marker for this, as to whether you should or shouldn't stay on the medication. One of the things that I often tell people is that medications ideally set the stage to make more enduring changes that can outlast the medications if you decide to go off them. So I would suggest taking a look at your life in retrospect. So look back before you started medication and then contrast that with your life now. Ask yourself some questions. Are there differences that you can notice? For example, maybe you've done some therapy and you've gained some insight and perspective about the root of your depression, and that's going to help you keep it from coming back. Maybe you've gained some coping skills that will allow you to manage depression way better than you did previously when you were struggling without the medication. Perhaps you've changed the group of people that you spend the most of your time with, or you found better ways to communicate and have your needs met with your partners. I say partners because just so happens this person is polyamorous. Maybe you found a better way to communicate with your people, and that's going to be something that outlasts the medication and really sets you up for success. These are all a lot of hypothetical scenarios, but hopefully you see what I'm getting at here. There are many things that antidepressants could free you up and allow you to change in your life, including habits and knowledge that may give you a better set of circumstances than you had previously. So you're set up for a better outcome without the medication than you had before. But I think you also need to do your own personal cost-benefit analysis with this. Anybody does, right? Cost benefit with medication is a really big deal. So you have to think about what are the benefits of this and what are some things that may be detractors. Side effects are something that are important to consider, and they can go either way. There could be side effects that get in the way of your life, Or there could be side effects that facilitate your life, right? So for antidepressants, for example, some people experience weight gain on antidepressants. If you've characteristically had a hard time keeping weight on, you're a very, very thin person, and that contributes to some frailty, then that could be a benefit. Or if you're somebody who has, somebody that has a penis and has, trouble with premature ejaculation, that's something where antidepressants could help reduce that. And so it facilitates your life in a way. And then, of course, both of those things can turn into, unwanted weight gain or anorgasmia in certain other people. So you have to decide, what you like and what you dislike about the medications and weigh those into the equation. Before I continue, let me take a quick break to talk about our sponsor. All right, this episode of the podcast is brought to you by OneSkin, a product that I was sent and I'm now a big fan of. I am very confused by skincare, by general health products, beauty products, anything that involves trying to make some sort of difference in your skin or hair or anything like that. It's very confusing, and honestly, I think a lot of it tends to be maybe overblown in its claims and very difficult to know if it's trustworthy or not. OneSkin is a really interesting product because it was founded by a team of 4 PhD-level longevity scientists with over 15 years of experience studying the biology of aging. After testing thousands of peptides, they discovered one that's scientifically proven to target cells that are the main source of aging and actually reduce the biological age by several years. Their flagship product that they sent me, OS1 Face, is clinically validated to improve firmness, fine lines, and overall tone and appearance of your skin. They also sent me an eye cream. And when I pulled these out, I was actually with my wife and my other partner at the time, and we were hanging out, and we got this package, and we opened them up, and we're like, dang, this stuff is cool. The packaging is very gender neutral, if that's something that matters to you. Just black and white, very clean design. And both of the products they sent me have refillable packages. They try to be a little bit eco-friendly there, which is amazing. So I've just been applying, a couple pumps of each in the morning and at night. Very easy part of my routine. And I think that I can see a difference. One thing that I dislike about a lot of creams is how heavy and oily they are. That's not the case here. I think that you will really enjoy OneSkin. So if you're looking for a easy solution for skincare, if you're looking to reduce the effects of aging in some sort of way on your skin, definitely check it out. For a limited time, our users can get 15% off OneSkin with our code DUFF at oneskin.co. So experience a new skin health routine at a discounted rate. Get 15% off with the code DUFF at oneskin.co. All right, back to the question here. So talking to your doctor about the medication balancing act is great, but I would also encourage you to talk to your support network, the people that are closest to you. Ultimately, I think your doctor is always going to tell you that, people tend to do this, but it's your choice. It's different for everybody, and you're going to get non-answers most of the time because there is no perfect answer. I think that your people who are close to you have a better perspective, and maybe their sort of gut check intuitive feeling could be more informative to you than getting your doctor to tell you what you already know. I would say that if you do go off your medication, you're most likely not going to discontinue them abruptly. Typically, that's not a good idea with psychiatric medications. You're going to taper down on them, meaning gradually reduce the amount that you're taking in a plan that you discuss with your doctor. If your doctor doesn't seem to be very well versed in this, there's a lot of good information online as well about tapering down from medications. You can even find forums dedicated to very specific medications where people share their experiences. But generally, things like SSRIs are not the biggest deal. Sometimes your SNRIs or tricyclics are a little bit harder to discontinue. But either way, you're going to get off it in a gradual sort of way. And it can take some time to normalize. It can take some time for your brain to normalize when coming off medications. Essentially, your brain has come to expect a boost in the available neurotransmitters, right? So these medications help things like serotonin or norepinephrine linger there in the brain, so there's more of it to be used, which means that, it doesn't have to produce as much on its own or have as many receptor sites open. So it downregulates a little bit when you're using this medication. And then when you go off of it, it might lead to you feeling a bit icky. But that's okay. It will come back. This is why you taper and do it gradually. In time, your brain will return to that baseline you're looking for, especially if you continue to put in effort on your part, because our bodies are really great at self-regulating and finding that homeostasis. So there's no shame in either choice. If you decide to stay on the medication without any immediate plan of coming off, and that works well for you, great. If you decide that you'd like to go off of them and see how that goes, also great. Either one is okay. And you can always come back to them. If you go off and realize that it's not working out for you, there's no reason you can't go back on medication, even if it's at a lower dose. That doesn't mean you failed at anything. It's just a normal part of the process. And I think there's some bravery in making these decisions and trying to decide on a course for yourself. So, my best advice overall would be to recognize that things can work either way. Spend some time reflecting, like I talked about, on your past and your present and seeing the difference there. Talk to your support network. Make sure that you're tapering during a time when a little bit of variability is okay. So I know that you're a musician, for instance. Maybe tapering in the middle of a tour is not the best idea because you kind of need to be on every night. But you always have options no matter what happens. And be proud of yourself for coming to this point. It's not like the ultimate goal for everybody has to be to get off medication. But I can hear that for you, your personal reasons have to do with the progress that you've made, which I think is really amazing. So thank you for the question. All right, so let's jump straight into the next one. Second question reads, "Hi, Dr. Duff, longtime listener, and I love the podcast. Before I met my partner, I tried for a baby for over a decade as a single person and was unsuccessful, although I did have several miscarriages. Most of this journey was before I even knew my current partner, and I only used him as a donor one time, so theoretically he should have very little attachment to my infertility. Yet when I'm intimate with my partner, I feel very uncomfortable sharing my body with him and cannot relax or enjoy myself. This is the uncomfortable feeling is only when I'm sexually active with a partner and does not occur when I'm engaged in masturbation. I do not really associate my partner with my fertility journey, and I want us to have a great sex life again, but I don't know how to feel sexy with him anymore, although I do feel very sexy when I'm by myself. Do you have any insight or suggestions here? Side note, I am now surgically sterile, so there's absolutely zero chance of pregnancy. Thanks." All right, so let's get into this. If you heard a little knock there, it's because I'm recording this while my kids are home. So, they want me to take pictures of them and stuff. Anyway, very good question, very vulnerable question. So I really appreciate it. Trying to parse through the question itself, it sounds like you've used donor sperm either directly or indirectly in the past as an attempt to get pregnant as a single person. And unfortunately, over the course of the decade or so that you've been trying that, or that you had tried that, it didn't work out, and you've had to live through several miscarriages. At some point, you used the person that's your current partner as a donor before he was your partner. And I'm not sure if that means that you had sex for this purpose or used some other method of doing that. Either way, you have some crossed wires where it feels like the sexual experience with him is not enjoyable, possibly because it brings up other feelings. And this aversion to sexual activity is only with him. So this is a tough situation. And first off, I'm sorry that you're experiencing this. Also, I'm glad that you're okay after all the physical and emotional trials that you've been through with your infertility journey. As always, I need to give the obvious suggestion. Therapy would be amazing for this issue, in particular sex therapy. This type of issue would be something that a sex therapist, especially one that is a good personality fit for you, they would be very enthusiastic about working with you on this. Not just something that they would be like, yeah, sure, we can do that, but they would be very happy to. It's within their realm, and it would be something that they would be pleased to do, I think. So definitely consider therapy, please. And aside from that, I would want to know some other information. First off, do you have specific thoughts or images that come up when you're engaging in sexual activity with your partner? For example, do you have a conscious association with the pain of infertility, right? Do you actually associate, him and that infertility that you've had to experience? Do you have specific uncomfortable images or thoughts that pop into your awareness when you're trying to be intimate? If so, these are things that I would advise you to approach, not avoid, and process them. I think that often we have a tendency to avoid thinking about things like this, which makes a degree of sense. You don't want to be thinking about them during sex, so why torture yourself by thinking of them outside of sex? Unfortunately, just as humans, what we avoid tends to grow. When I say approach and process, I don't necessarily mean during sex or intimacy, though that can be an option. But I mean that this can be on your own and in whatever way makes sense to you. Meaning just don't pretend like those feelings aren't there, those thoughts aren't there. Don't try to convince yourself that there's no connection. If there is one, process it and work it out. I'm also curious if you've ever talked to your partner about this. Sometimes keeping things like this to yourself can make them even worse because you're trying to hide it, right? You're trying to not let it get in the way. And as such, you feel dread about not being able to hide it well or hurting your partner's feelings. So when you get into the situation where you're maybe going to become intimate, you get worried. You're like, oh crap, what if it happens? Oh my God. You start getting worked up about it, and then boom, there it is. And it's so hard to be in the moment. If you haven't talked about it at all, and he's clearly able to see that there is something going on with your intimate relationship, then he could be drawing totally different conclusions about it. Obviously, you have the right to share or not share your own personal information, but there are circumstances where it could be helpful. So I think that talking about it openly and letting him know that it's not a lack of attraction, it's not something personal about him or a dissatisfaction in the relationship, but that you're having a hard time feeling comfortable, probably due to your own history, that provides a platform for you guys to work on it and for you to be less concerned or embarrassed about the prospect of it happening again. To me, this is similar to my own experience when I've told people I'm anxious during a talk. So, for instance, there was a talk that I was giving during the height of the COVID pandemic. So it was remote, and it had been quite a while since I've given a talk to a professional audience. I forget, I think it might have been social workers or some other kind of community agency. And I was giving them a talk, something related to my career as a neuropsychologist. And I was feeling anxious as fuck, like dry mouth, like having a hard time breathing, physiologically ramped up. And, I was like, okay, I just need to tell them. So I was like, okay, guys, I'm very anxious right now. It's been a long time since I've done one of these, and for some reason it's really hitting me. Trust me when I say that I know what I'm talking about, but I'm probably going to sound like I'm out of breath and maybe trail off a little bit during the start here. Hopefully we ease into it though. And so I told them that, and everyone, sort of, I can see their faces like, nod along, and they get it. So being open about that helps me diffuse the tension, and of course lets other people know that I do know what I'm talking about. And I'm just anxious, and that's okay. You had mentioned that independently on your own, you can feel sexy and get pleasure from masturbation, and that's great to know. So we know it's not like a self-concept issue or some sort of disgust about sexuality or some sort of organic physiological, sexual dysfunction. I think a lot of people have similar circumstances where there are issues that only pop up in certain contexts, so it can be confusing. I mean, even for myself as a polyamorous person, I've had multiple partners, sometimes concurrently, and there are situations where certain issues or styles, quirks, whatever you want to call them, are present with certain partners and not others. And that's not a judgment or something to be said about the quality of the relationship. It's just sort of how things go sometimes. So it's a good thing to know that there are contexts in which this isn't an issue. That means that there's something we can probably do here. I think that in addition to being honest with your partner and with yourself about the issue, I think you may consider taking a little bit of a step back and focus on trying to normalize the experience of being intimate with all of its messiness and awkwardness. And with that, you might use some variation of what we call sensate focus. This is something that you would do in sex therapy potentially. With sensate focus, what you do is with your partner, you take a step back from the kind of goal-oriented mindset of sexual activity and often, direct intercourse, and instead focus on the process of physical and emotional intimacy. And the idea is you take a structured approach, starting with minimal physical contact, and then you gradually include more and more intimate contact and exploration of erogenous zones, essentially finding a pace that's gradual and comfortable for both of you. And it's sort of like an exposure process. You kind of normalize the experience and you don't jump in head first. You kind of build your way there. And also it's a platform to communicate. So you keep open communication throughout the process and you explore. And often by the time you get to the end of that line, things feel so comfortable that you just want to jump each other's bones. But it can work differently for everyone. Ideally, this is done with a sex therapist, but you can also create your own homebrew versions. Essentially, you just start with talking and maybe holding hands, caressing each other, clothes on, and just be intimate in that sort of way. And you talk about it. You talk about what feels comfortable and uncomfortable for you, what you like, what you dislike, any thoughts or feelings that come up in the process. And that's what you do. You spend, 20 minutes, 30 minutes doing that, and you leave it at that. And then the next time you go a little bit further. Maybe you take off some clothes. Maybe you involve a little bit more touching of erogenous zones and heavy petting and such. And then from there, you take off some more clothes and you involve maybe, using lips more, using other parts of the body more. And then you go to, a little bit further and a little bit further until you work your way all the way to, whatever it is that you would like to be able to do comfortably, if that's penetrative sex or using toys or what have you, sort of whatever you think that you would like to build up to. And you work your way there very gradually. And hopefully through that process, you're gaining a lot of comfort and you're normalizing it. And it's not going to be difficult once you actually get there. So that's what that would look like. Aside from sex therapy, focusing directly on the issue with your partner as well, I think that it could also be simply a little bit more healing and processing that needs to happen on your part. I can't tell you exactly what you're feeling, but in a lot of cases that look like yours, I could imagine there's a deep disappointment in having sex without the potential of being pregnant. Even if you've typically enjoyed sex for pleasure in the past, even if you've made peace with the fact that you're never going to become pregnant, it can still be deep and it can still be hard. One way of thinking about this is, again, thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic and how many people were loners and introverts and elected to spend time on their own before the pandemic. But once the restrictions were in place and they were not allowed to be around other people, they had a much harder time emotionally with the isolation than when it was self-imposed, because there's a choice there, right? So similarly, in the past, you could have sex for pleasure. It didn't have to be for reproduction, but it could be. You had that choice. And then when you come to realize that you have trouble with fertility and you don't have a choice there, that becomes harder. At least it can. So again, that's sort of just a guess as to how you might be feeling, but I think there could be more for you to dig into there independently or with a therapist. It could be that sex and intimacy are currently reminders of those lack of options that you have, and that still stings. Overall, I want to encourage you to communicate and approach these issues. There's nothing wrong with you, and it's totally reasonable for you to be having this struggle. But I do think that, if the two of you as individuals without this issue have a capacity for a good sex life, right? If you guys can have good sex together and you could enjoy it, then there's a way to get there. There's a way to work through this. So I want to wish you the best of luck. Please consider the options that I talked about. And even if these are just jumping off points for you and you can work on your own version of this, then I think that you can do so. I have faith and I hope it works out well for you. And with that, everybody, this is the end of the episode. This has been episode 357 of the Hardcore Self-Help Podcast. I hope that you learned something from this. Hopefully it didn't sound too disjointed. I did get interrupted like 30 times, so I had to do a lot of stitching and editing. Learn my lesson. Don't record when the kids are awake and when there's not somebody else to watch after them. Oh, goodness. But alas, here we are. I hope you learned something, as I said, and I hope that you're taking really good care of yourselves. I'll see you for the next episode. Bye.